I've been asked recently to address two issues. The first is whether or not the layman can be elected as pope, and the second is whether or not laity can elect a pope. And I would like to refer to Wikipedia, the article on Pope Michael, and quote, "The central thesis of Ben's opposition to Baden is the claim that the laity cannot under any circumstance participate in the election of a pope, and that a mere layman cannot be elected pope." And then I'd like to refer to another place where it is declared, "It has been proven from divine law, from infallible church teaching, and from the history of the church herself, that the laity cannot validly elect a pope. This is reserved to the clergy alone in an emergency, with the laity only as consultants." So the question is, are these two statements true, or are they false? Let us first go to the question, can a layman be elected pope? If you look at the various election laws, they are silent on the qualifications to be elected pope. We can say that they rest on certain simple presumptions. They presume, first of all, that a man is baptized and capable of rational thought. Thus, a woman or a child is incapable of being elected pope. They rest also on the presumption that the person is not a heretic. And let us proceed forward. Remember, papal election laws give absolutely no qualifications whatsoever. Look it up. Pope Pius XII gave a speech on October 5, 1957 to an audience about the lay apostolate. I'll quote the English translation of this speech in French. "If a layman were elected pope, he could accept the election only with the condition of being ready to receive ordination and being willing to receive ordination. The capacity to teach and control, as well as the charism of infallibility, would be granted to him as of the moment of its acceptance, even before his ordination." And let us go to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the article on conclave, which states, "Strictly speaking, any male Christian who has reached the use of reason can be chosen, not, however, a heretic, a schismatic, or a notorious Seminist." And William H. Fanning, also in the Catholic Encyclopedia, in his article on papal election, states, "A layman may also be elected as pope, as was Celestine V. Even the election of a married man would not be invalid," and he gives a reference to some decree, qui uxorum. "Of course, the election of a heretic, a schismatic, or female would be null and void. Immediately on the canonical election of a candidate and his acceptance, he is true pope, and can exercise full and absolute jurisdiction over the whole church. The papal election therefore needs no confirmation, as the pontiff has no superior on earth." And if we look at history, 20 laymen, at least, have been elected to the papacy. That is, on the day of their election, they were laymen in the morning, they were pope in the evening, which is sufficient proof in and of itself that it can be done. Because remember, what did these people state? I'll go back. "It has been proven from divine law, infallible church teaching, and from history of the church herself that the laity cannot validly elect a pope. Okay, also that a layman cannot be elected pope." So a layman can be elected pope. The last one was Saint Peter Celestine V, which we mentioned above. And I'd like to quote from Will the Catholic Church Survive the 20th Century on page 311. Let us construct a syllogism here. First, Pius XII teaches that a layman can be elected pope, and we quoted that above. 2. The papacy is the highest honor and office one can receive in the church. Certainly true. 3. Therefore, if one can receive such an honor validly, and they can, one can also cast the vote that conveys it, since an act of an elector is of less important nature than any act of a true pope. So this brings us to the second question. can the laity elect a pope? Now this question is a bit more complex. Throughout history, the Church has always had a law in place on who and how to elect a pope. We can presume St. Peter gave instructions to the early church in Rome on what to do when he died. Because, he knew he was going to die. Of these early elections, all we know is that they follow the pattern of elections of bishops throughout the world. The clergy and laity of the Church of Rome elected their bishop just as they did in Constantinople when it was founded, Antioch, Jerusalem, wherever. The surrounding bishops then came and consecrated him as a bishop, and that held for centuries. Provided the ordinary electors of the Pope exist, they ought to elect the Pope. And that's only reasonable. That's why laws are set in place for order in a perfect society. And the Church, the Catholic Church, is a perfect society. Perfect, not meaning that it is perfect and we're all sinless. Perfect in that it possesses all that it needs to discharge its offices and to maintain itself until the end of time. Now, I said the ordinary electors, when they exist, and throughout history they've existed most of the time, I say they ought to elect the Pope, because this did not invalidate 3 times in history when the cardinals, who were the ordinary electors at the time, existed, and Emperor Henry III appointed Pope after Pope after Pope. And let's look at this event in history. It's a kind of a bad time in history. After buying the papacy from Benedict IX, Gregory VI then resigned and the Emperor Henry III appointed Clement II. Okay, Gregory VI bought the papacy from Benedict IX. He bought it. The Church, you read in their list of popes, Benedict IX, Gregory VI, they're both listed in there. There is an asterisk by Benedict IX because after he sold the papacy, he tried to regain it. Okay, that caused confusion. Okay, now, Gregory VI was persuaded, you shouldn't have bought the papacy. He did it because he thought it was better for him to have it than Benedict. And I have to agree, reading history, he was right on that point. But then he said, yes, you're right, I should resign. He stepped out of the way. The emperor steps in and appoints Clement II. After the death of Clement II, Henry III then appointed Pope Damasus II. And then after his death, Pope Leo IX, who finally restored order to the papacy, and we went back to the ordinary elections. Okay? Now, in the list of popes, Benedict IX, Gregory VI, Clement II, Damasus II, and Saint Leo IX are all considered as valid popes. So, although illegitimate, obviously, because it was against the letter of the law, the Emperor Henry III's action was considered valid. And so much so that the last pope he appointed has been canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church. A single layman elected, basically appointment by one, is the same as election by several, appointed 3 popes, one of whom has been canonized. Okay. If we go back further in history, we find the Empress Theodora electing Pope Vigilius way back. Let us go to the Catholic Encyclopedia and read. Vigilius, 540, and Pelagius I, 553, were forced on the Church at imperial dictation. In the case of the latter, there seems to have been no election. His title was validated solely through his recognition as bishop by clergy and people. Okay? 2 more cases validated. The Church accepts them as valid. Now, canonists may vary on why they believe it's valid. They may argue about some of these things, but we accept it. And let's go to John the 11th in the Catholic Encyclopedia and what it says about him. Through the intrigues of his mother, who ruled at that time in Rome, he was raised to the chair of Peter and was completely under the influence of the senatrix at Patricia of Rome. In other words, John the 11th's mother was running the papacy. Again, he's in every list. And much could be said about Pope John the 11th, but in spite of all of his evils, he was nonetheless Pope. Remember, being pope does not make you a saint. There have been sinners in the papacy, and I am sure there are probably popes burning in hell. And I ask you pray for me that I don't join them. Okay? Now let us go on to Pope Marinus II, and the Catholic Encyclopedia says of him, a Roman and a cardinal of the title of St. Cyricus, he was one of the popes placed on the throne of St. Peter by the power of Alberic, prince of the Romans, and who, though virtuous, durst not put their hands to anything without his permissions. In other words, another pope intruded into the papacy, placed in by a layman, considered valid. And let's go to Benedict XVIII and what the Catholic Encyclopedia says about him. You can look all this up. The first of the Tusculan popes, being the son of Gregory, Count of Tusculum and Maria, and brother of John the 19th, he was, though a layman, imposed on the chair of Peter by force. Nevertheless, dislodging a rival, he became a good and strong ruler. So in other words, we have confirmation here of a layman being imposed on the chair of Peter. Papal elections are not always regular. Read my book, Upon This Rock. I go into these into greater detail, okay, if you need to know. We have now seen 9 cases of extraordinary papal elections that would be considered irregular. In many of these, the laity either interfered or appointed the pope straight out. Now, St. Alphonsus says, it matters little if in past centuries a given pontiff was elected in an illegitimate fashion, or took possession of the pontificate by means of fraud. It suffices that he was subsequently accepted as pope by the entire church, because from this done he becomes a true pontiff. In other words, fraud would not invalidate the papacy. We've seen selling it. I didn't think of it until I read this, that the papacy was personal property, and I don't think it should be thought of as that. It's a sacred trust. But I could sell the papacy, not that I have any intention of doing it. But I could validly do it. But I would not do it because it would be wrong. Let us go back. Let us continue with a few more instances. Many elections have been unlawful, and that the law in place at the time was violated. The second longest vacancy in history was ended by an election by compromise, because the cardinals simply could not agree. Election by compromise. There's election by ballot, compromise, and inspiration. The time it was ballot and inspiration were the two in the law. The cardinals, they could not get it together. They couldn't figure out. And finally they said, we'll take, I think it was 6. You 6, you go off and elect a pope, and we'll accept whoever you elect. Let's get this over with. In fact, they're getting tired of it. The laity had intervened in this papal election. Because it was taking so long, they asked some advice, and they boarded up the windows and left one opening through which they passed through bread and water. So they put them on a fast. That didn't get them going, so they pulled the roof off. They didn't ask advice on that one, because I'm sure their advisors said, no, you can't pull the roof off. So they said, we've got to get a pope, we pull the roof off. Cardinals finally said, we got to get a pope because it's getting cold here without a roof. So, invalid on the face of it, totally accepted. The Pope never doubted. What did that Pope do? He added compromise to the papal election law. And if you take a look at the Western Schism, the councils of Constance and Pisa, especially the Council of Constance, which actually ended the vacancy, was still extraordinary. In looking at history, what is necessary for a valid papal election is a vacancy in the papacy. Okay, in 1990, we will presume the proof of the vacancy which has been presented elsewhere. Given this, we proceed to the situation. The vacancy began October 9, 1958, with the death of Pope Pius XII. For July 16, 1990, all the ordinary electors had died or resigned by heresy, thus there were no cardinals. And we will quote from Monsignor Charles Journet, The Church of the Word Incarnate. You can find this online. During a vacancy of the apostolic see, neither the church nor the council can contravene the provisions already laid down to determine the valid mode of election. And he refers to Cardinal Cajetan. However, in case of permission, for example, if the Pope has provided nothing against it, or in case of ambiguity, for example, if it is unknown who the true cardinals are, or who the true Pope is, as was the case at the time of the Great Schism, that's the Western Schism, the power of applying the papacy to such and such a person devolves on the universal church, the Church of God. Okay? So we're saying, in an extraordinary situation, according to Journain, the universal church, the Church of God, has the means of somehow providing itself with a pope. And let us go to the canonist Billot, who states, in case of doubt, however, that is, when it is unknown if someone be a true cardinal, or when the Pope is dead or uncertain, as seems to have happened at the time of the Great Schism, which began under Urban VI, it is to be affirmed that the power to apply the papacy to a person, the due requirements having been complied with, resides in the Church of God. And then, by way of devolution, it is seen that this power descends to the universal church, since electors determined by the Pope do not exist. Okay, basically, V.O. is quoting from Cajetan, who came before him. Thus, by the natural law, the Catholic Church, as a perfect society, always has a way, here and now, to provide itself with a Pope. And no matter how irregular this method may be, it will be absolutely valid. And I'd like to return to the Catholic Encyclopedia, the article on councils. Reverend J. Wilhelm. A council, acting independently of the Vicar of Christ, is unthinkable in the Constitution of the Church. Such assemblies have only taken place in times of great constitutional disturbances, when either there was no pope, or the rightful pope was indistinguishable from anti-popes. In such abnormal times, the safety of the Church becomes the supreme law, and the first duty of the abandoned flock is to find a new shepherd under whose direction the existing evils may be remedied. Let's stop and think about this a minute. If this is true, which it is, if this is true in a case when we have no pope or distinguishable from anti-popes, what is it? The abandoned flock is to find a new shepherd under whose direction the existing evils may be remedied. St. Constance, Father Wilhelm is speaking to you. So think about it. So as a perfect society, that is a society that possesses all the means of its maintenance and preservation, the Catholic Church always has a way to provide herself with a pope here and now. In other words, it has some way right now. If the papacy is vacant and the times are extraordinary, there is a way to do it here and now. We don't have to wait for something. Okay? We have had 261 papal elections. Most have gone smoothly, and a few, as we have seen above, were irregular. And let us look at Nicholas of Flue, who died in 1487. The Church will be punished because the majority of her members, high and low, will become so perverted. The Church will sink deeper and deeper until she will at last seem to be extinguished, and the succession of Peter and the other apostles to have expired. But after this she will be victoriously exalted in the sight of all doubters. Now, this comes from a book by Father Culleton, which is duly imprimatur. Nicholas of Flue was never condemned for this statement. So, there's nothing wrong with it. The Church will seem to be extinguished. Church cannot be extinguished, and he never said that. The succession of Peter and the other apostles will seem to have expired. That will appear to be. In other words, that's how bad it is. We're down to no apostolic succession, or no apparent apostolic succession. The great apostasy liquidated most of the clergy, and those who remained either would not or could not participate in the election of a pope. Okay? Would not, that would be all the traditionalist clergy throughout the world that were contacted about the papal election in the late 1980s. Okay? Could not. bishops and priests existing behind the iron bamboo curtains. Okay? They exist best we know. We've heard of them, that they may still be in existence, their successors. They could not participate. They are prevented by their imprisonment. So the laity, after attempting to contact every Catholic cleric in the world, proceed to elect a pope and to provide the church with a head. Now we have established that the laity can elect a pope. Then how did we proceed in 1990? The effort to elect a pope was first proposed by Father Sáenz Arriaga of Mexico in the mid-1970s. He was working with Fathers Carmona and Zamora, who visited with Archbishop Lefebvre on May 22, 1976 on this matter. I happen to know because I was there when they arrived. It was common knowledge all over the place. These Mexican bishops, or Mexican priests, they were Mexican priests at the time, were here to talk to Archbishop Lefebvre about electing a pope. This inspired Father Karl Povermacher, who was also there at the time, a little less than a year later, to say, right after a mass I assisted at in Oklahoma City, someday we will have to elect a pope. He was inspired by what was going on. Okay? In 1981, Fathers Carmona and Zamora were consecrated bishops by Bishop Peter Martinillo den Took for the sole purpose of preserving the apostolic succession of holy orders until a pope could be elected. They then in turn consecrated as bishops Fathers George Musey and Louis Vasalis. And this was discussed in meetings in 1982 and 1983. In 1983, I think it's in January, you look at Bishop Took's Wikipedia page. A short account of it is there. I think the pictures remain. All of these bishops, including, and some priests, were all together Bishop Took, Carmona, Zamora, Musey, Vasalis, Father McKenna, who later became a bishop, Father Siebert, who was eventually consecrated, Father Thomas Fooey, who was eventually consecrated bishop in the Took line, there to discuss the election of a pope. At the end of 1983, Bishop Musey published an open letter to Archbishop Lefebvre on this very subject. Okay? Archbishop Lefebvre had a priest of his own society investigating the possibility of electing a pope about the same time he consecrated 4 men as bishops in 1988. In fact, I know this from the person the priest contacted for information, because he contacted me and said, "What do you think?" I forget the priest's name, but I told this man to give the priest all the information we had. We've got nothing to hide. The doctrines of the divine Catholic faith, the laws of the church, they're for everybody. We have nothing to hide. And yet, in spite of all of this effort, nothing happened. That is why, in 1987, when I became convinced that it was a matter of divine law we had to elect a pope, I proceeded. And I was not alone. There are many others, and I'll discuss that in another video. But we'll come back to the main point of this video. The central thesis of Ben's opposition to Baden is the claim that the laity cannot under any circumstance participate in the election of a pope, and that a mere layman cannot be elected pope. We have disproven Mrs. Ben's proposition on both points. She is absolutely wrong there, and therefore we can set these aside. The election of 1990 is certainly valid. There is absolutely no reason to question it. The laity can participate in the election of a pope even when the ordinary electors exist, and at one time they were part of the ordinary electors. Therefore, they can proceed on their own when the clergy either cannot or will not proceed. Because the laity, as Catholics, we have a right to have a living, breathing pope. And that's the subject of another video. And we have proven from history, this statement of Pope Pius XII, of other theologians and canonists, a layman can be elected. Laymen have been elected. I hope this answers your question.